Hey guys, welcome back from China yesterday. Today I want to talk about some more random lore stuff, a couple of oddball topics, things that have been interesting to me, things I found out about the game recently, or just general theories about the lore. We did a really crackpot one last time. This was Random Lore 3, in which we discussed the idea that because Morgemoth creates minions as clones, and because an Elder Dragon minion can, in theory, rise up to become the next Elder Dragon, as we saw Glint with Krakatorik, in theory, Morgemoth, because Morgemoth corrupted Ore, Morgemoth could corrupt Zaitan's body, clone it, and then when Morgemoth dies, Zaitan Morgemoth version becomes the next Elder Dragon. It was a crazy video. Anyway, a few of the other things we discussed were on the idea of the Forgotten, and particularly these golden areas. Now, there's been a big lore bomb since the last Random Lore episode I did, and this was on the Exalted and the Mursaat, and I do want to talk a little bit more about that here. I want to express something. The dust has settled a little, and I think it's a really fun idea that I was just a little bit cautious about talking about earlier. But before we get into that, somebody did ask me, I mentioned in the previous video about these golden areas. We were talking specifically about the Auric Orb, and we were talking about this weird artifact that appears in Ore and seems to repel Zaitan's corruption, just as the blue orb did, that the crate recovered, that we then took for ourselves at Fort Trinity. And so the question kind of is, does this Auric Orb A, have some relevance to an Elder Dragon, or B, was this kind of power that was being used by the Forgotten, specifically with their golden-looking areas, to create places like Tarir that we've heard about, and, some of the other locations. Anyone, someone specifically asked, what I said in the last video, that we had a bunch of golden locations around Tyria. What are they? Well, as far as I remember, there are like 3 that have been referenced. Now, don't get confused. There is a region in Elona called Vabi, which is incredibly wealthy and gorgeous, and it's ran by merchant princes, okay? And there are big golden structures there, or places that appear gilded at least. There's a specific hidden city with a large chamber in it that is just made basically of pure gold and just piles and mountains of gold, as far as I remember, as far as the eyes can see. That's not exactly the same as what we saw in Season 2 of The Living World. So, here are the locations that we've seen. We have Guild Wars 2, Season 2 of The Living World, where we go to a cave in the Silver Wastes. This roughly translates to a location in Guild Wars 1. The Silver Wastes used to be a place called a lagoon, the Mamnoon Lagoon, and you really wouldn't be able to tell from looking at it in Guild Wars 2. ArenaNet didn't really honor very well old areas versus new. Now, in theory, you can give them the benefit of the doubt, and there's a kind of a cool theory here, by the way, which is that the giant cave beneath the Silver Wastes is the dried up Mamnoon Lagoon, and the script there, perhaps it's no coincidence then, are trying to fill it with water once more, so that they're, with their boat and so on, but the idea is actually they're trying to refill Mamnoon Lagoon, this old water place in GW1. It's kind of just an interesting coincidence, in my opinion, though. But we have this cave. I actually did a video series quite recently, where I looked at a cliff face in Guild Wars 1 and said, yeah, this is basically the cliff face where supposedly the Golden Cave is, and this was a location that we'd heard the Forgotten went to. From the blog post ArenaNet released, it now seems like it was about 50 years before Guild Wars 1 that place was created, and that Glint had even sent the Forgotten there at all. But what else did we have? Well, GW1, there were a couple of places. They're very mysterious. Number 1 is in the Mists. Now, we have an idea of the Mists being like the universe, right, at large, the place that houses all the realms, and when you die, your spirit travels to the Mists, and supposedly all those top-notch heroes, the best of the best, the cream of the crop, if you are like a complete badass, then you would go, not just to the Mists, but you'd go to the very center of the Mists, an area called the Rift, where time doesn't even move forward or backward anymore. And in the very middle of the Rift is a place called the Hall of the Heroes. This was actually a place you could visit as a player. Not because you died or anything, but because you voluntarily traveled to the Mists. So the story was this, that a long time before Guild Wars 1 started, there was this powerful mage, a human mage, called Lord Aegean. A character I often confuse with King Doric. A lot of videos I record I have to re-record because I'm accidentally saying Lord Aegean instead of King Doric. But Lord Aegean was the first of the, I think they call him the first mortal, but he could be the first human to enter the Mists. He opened up these rifts that opened up a portal to the other side. And he was like the only one really capable of doing it. Where he opened these portals, demons and denizens of the mist would seek to escape, and they kind of became sort of dangerous places. Eventually, Lord Audrin was said to have been killed because he'd explore the mists, but in his hubris, the creatures on the other side would get angry with him. They wouldn't like that he was there, and eventually he was torn apart by them, and he died. But his portals remained. And so, after those portals came into existence, humans from various areas around the world, because he opened multiple of them all over the world, they decided, no, we've got to close these portals. These cannot be allowed to exist. They've got to be hidden. They've got to be stowed away. And different people treated them differently. One of the portals specifically was in the Crystal Desert, and ultimately, I won't go into the primeval kings, but ultimately had a tomb built over it by a later society, and then so you kind of got this idea that there's this desolate desert where no one is left alive, is the remains of a civilization long since gone. The dead of that civilization were being interred in this tomb of their kings, and in the very bottom of this tomb of the primeval kings was a portal to the mists. And Chirai Ossa, in death, finally wants to pass on into the afterlife. And as kind of a side story of Guild Wars 1, is that you travel through this tomb with him into the mists. And this, technically, when Guild Wars 1 launched, was actually where some of the most competitive PvP took place. It was kind of a PvP storyline thing where, you know, the first map you go through, you're in a deathmatch map against another team of human players, and you PvP it out with them. If you won, you progress onto the next map, and then you'd have to play like King of the Hill, and then you'd progress onto the next map, which was, I think, another variation of deathmatch, and the next, and they had loads of these maps. Unfortunately, eventually the population and the player base never supported so many maps, so if you went in there, you'd have like the first map, but then if there was no one like qualifying to meet you on the second map, you just like skip multiple maps ahead. But in theory, there is the idea of traveling through every single map and all of this geography as you travel deeper into the mists. And that's some fascinating ideas there. There was like a 6v6 game type of teams of 8. It was pretty mental. But then eventually you did not just go into the mists, but you went to the Rift too, and you got to go to the Hall of the Heroes. And what did the Hall of Heroes look like? Well, it was golden. It was this weird golden architecture. It was very much, seems to me, to be maybe related now to the Forgotten. The Forgotten themselves, who we know have existence in the mist, because we saw a lot of them in the Realm of Torment. So, for the first time, it actually seems like maybe we know the architects of this great place, but there were weird statues there as well, of winged beings who, you know, we still haven't necessarily 100% identified theories that perhaps they were the race that Dwayne hailed from, or harpies before they fell, or any of these kinds of ideas. So that was one of the golden places, primarily like the big one. But there was another one in the desert too, and of course the desert we know had a lot of Forgotten hanging around there, even back in GW1. They lived there with Glint, this was their place, and there was actually a giant mesa named Augury Rock. So it's this big, unassuming mesa, just, you know, a rock outcrop in the middle of the desert. But the second you get to the that area of the storyline, you and some of the other heroes, Devona, Sin, Aiden, and so forth, you scout it out, and you all look at it, and you're like, that looks really weird. There's some magic coming off of this place. There's an oddity here. And it's actually around this mesa that you eventually ascend and become closer to the gods. So the theory here is that this rock was somehow manufactured, not by the Forgotten, but by the gods. But then, as we know in Guild Wars 2, there are a lot of things that humans thought were manufactured or done by the gods, like, you know, giving magic out, or the Bloodstone itself, right? Humans thought that they were manufactured by the gods, but they were actually manufactured by these older races, the Seers in that case. So is it possible that even this Hall of Ascension wasn't done by the gods either? But the idea is in the desert, you kind of scout this rock out. It's my favorite arcs from Guild Wars 1 for a lot of reasons. And one of them is you kind of visit this rock and it's just kind of this big thing. And then you go off and do all these different missions, zigzagging back all the time, placing like these additional things on these pedestals in front of the rock. And then eventually you complete the rites of ascension and it explodes open and you get to travel inside. What do you find inside this rock? Well, another giant, beautiful, golden room. So those are the three places I think we've seen actually in-game got to play in. You've also got the Auric Orb in Ore, and then you've also got the story about Saul Delesio as he first met what he thought were the Mursaat. And so that's the idea, and now I really want to talk about this this little theory here. So, for those out of the loop, a very brief sum up is this, that the Exalted, who we thought were Mursaat, perhaps before this information came out, the Exalted, these creatures that are in the jungle that we'll be interacting with, are not necessarily Mursaat at all. The devs revealed that they are the souls of humans who collaborated with Forgotten 50 years before Guild Wars 1. Glint foresaw the rise of the Elder Dragons. She wanted to prepare the world, so she sought out humans, possibly because they were the most numerous of the races out there, possibly because the Dwarves themselves, even though the Dwarves had a lot of interaction with Glint, they were like destined for other things. They sought out humans, tested them, trialed them, that's important, and we're going to come back to that fact in a second, and built them into these immortal, durable, things that do not age, things that do not eat, things that do not sleep, creatures that nonetheless retain all their sensibilities and personalities from when they were alive. And these guys built a giant golden city with the Forgotten. And then they kind of all went into hibernation until the Elder Dragons awoke. So when I did my video recap on this, actually, one thing that I thought was really cool was I did express in my video that it's cool because these are humans alive from 50 years before GW1, so this puts them alive around the time of the Guild Wars. But what's even better is they've been asleep most of this 300-year gap, and so when they wake up in Guild Wars 2, in theory, these humans can give us a lot of, like, fresh perspective and fresh knowledge about that world 300 years ago and kind of give us some cool information. Maybe we'll find, you know, some of these humans come from families that fiercely hated other human nations, and, you know, maybe they'll be sad to hear that Or's been blown up. Maybe they'll be sad to hear that the Char live in Ascalon. Maybe some of these humans, guys, will, in fact, most of them will be out and out racist to the Char. They will hate the Char. Maybe we'll get an element of that back. I sincerely doubt it, because I don't think they really want to write that kind of stuff in. I guess they're probably just going to be a goody two-shoes race, and that's going to be it. But hey, it's a nice idea, right? So anyway, that's a bit of a side topic. This is what the Exalted are, and it would seem that they got nothing to do with the Mursaat. But then there are a lot of weird similarities, a lot of things that don't seem to quite make sense. Like, for example, Saul D'Alessio was in Crater. He went to a forest nearby, potentially the Maguma jungle, potentially, not necessarily. He found a golden city, and there were these floating creatures there, just like the Exalted, that came to him and said, hey, yeah, you're awesome, go teach everyone about us, we'll save you from the Char, blah, blah, blah. It's like, why do Arena start the story that there's a golden city, and then there's another race of floating people who are a golden city, but they're not really the same? And so there is a theory that ties them together. I was a little bit less willing to talk about this, you know, in the couple of days after the blog post came out, because we certainly were in a bit of a weird place where a lot of people were like, they're obviously not Mursaat, and the idea of expressing a theory like this kind of, it feels like it's shoehorning them in a bit too much. But it is an interesting idea. And it's that the Exalted aren't Mursaat, but the Mursaat are Exalted. Now, if you can already wrap your head around that idea, then sweet, but a lot of people probably can't. Alright, so I'll take the theory, I'll tell you the history of Tyria if this theory ends up to be true, okay? So we need to rewind the clock a long time ago. We need to rewind the clock to all the way back when it was the previous races against the Elder Dragons, okay? Their last rising. We had the Jotun, we had the Dwarves, we had the Seers, we had the Forgotten. Now, the idea here is that the Forgotten, or the Seers perhaps, or one of these ancient races, developed a technique for building soldiers of their own. We already know that the Forgotten do this. They have their enchanted armors, and the idea of, like, golemancing stuff is probably not new when you go on such huge time scales, right? So the idea would be that one of these races, let's assume the Forgotten, first of all. The Forgotten, this race that has access to all this gold building technology, the Auric Orb, whatever, right? These guys are like, we need more forces to take out the Elder Dragons. Let's create the Exalted. So they develop the technique for creating Exalted. But the Exalted need a soul. And so they have to go to another race, maybe themselves, maybe they turn their own people into Exalted, or they have to find an abundant race, and they have to turn them into Exalted, right? So who do they pick? Who did they pick? Well, this could maybe tie into the Jotun, the fall of the Jotun. Maybe they picked tons of Jotun. Maybe back then, 10,000 years ago, there was a race of creatures on Tyria called Mursaat, okay? And they were the abundant ones. They were like the humans. The humans didn't, in theory, exist on Tyria at all at this point. And so maybe the Forgotten went to these old primitive versions of Mursaat. Mursaat like we've never seen before, right? And they said, all right, you guys, do you want to become warriors? And they were like, yeah, hell yeah, let's do it. So they just created tons of Exalted. Now, the important part of this theory would be that the Forgotten at this point, when creating this original wave of Exalted, didn't test them, didn't trial them, didn't see if they had pure dedication, as the blog post was called. And so they create all of these Exalted. They have these powerful creatures. But because when they make Exalted, those that become them retain all their personalities and ambitions and fears and flaws, perhaps then this original wave of Exalted got together and they were like, mates, we can't do this. We can't beat the Elder Dragons. It's too hard. I know we were created to do it, but look, we've just been given all this power by the Forgotten. Let's just take it and run. Let's get out of it. And everyone's like, and they're all like, yeah, okay, let's do it. And they betray the other races. They flee. And so all the races hate them. And what I'm basically saying is this original wave of Exalted, these are the Mursaat. The Elder Dragons destroy everything. Whatever the conclusion of the last cycle is, occurs. The Mursaat return, these Exalted return, and then the other races hate them. They go to war, they war with the Seers. Maybe this is why they warred with the Seers, perhaps. Maybe the original wave of Exalted wasn't made by Forgotten, but was made by Seers instead, and then the Seers had a great stake in it, and that's why they went to war so heavily against one another. But for whatever reason, These original Exalted end up winning, and that's the story as we know it. Then the Forgotten cleanse Glint, and Glint's like, oh, I'm so sorry that I've been trying to kill you under Kralkatorrik's yoke. Trust me, I'm a friend to all living things. And the Forgotten like, yeah, everyone living's really cool. Do you know who aren't cool, though? The Mursaat. They suck. You know, we created these guys. You know, we created them to fight for us, and they just backstabbed us, and they ruined everything for us. And Glint's like, huh, okay, well, I'm sort of prophetic, so the Flameseeker prophecies happen, this self-fulfilling prophecy, and, you know, the Mursaat end up getting wiped out. Glint kind of does a solid for the Forgotten. So then, what does Glint say at this point? She's like, well, look, another Elder Dragon Rising is coming. The Forgotten are really the only ones left around at this point. The Jotun have fallen, the Seers are basically wiped out. And she's like, look, I know you guys aren't going to like the sound of this, but let's be honest here, those creatures you created, the Exalted, they were badass. We need to do that again. We need to do it again, but here's the thing. And the Forgotten like, no, we don't want to do it. She says, here's the thing. You need to trial them. You need to test them. You need to make sure that they are pure and that they're not going to betray us again. And then they're like, okay, all right, we'll try it out. So who do we pick? And she's like, try the humans. They're everywhere. Go for it. And so then the Exalted, we now know, and this explains all the similarities. This explains a lot of different things. And it also has kind of this interesting idea that then the Exalted are created, the ones we know, the friendly ones, the ones made of humans. And then when they go to sleep, the old Exalted, the creatures we now know as Mursaat, they see that they've gone into hibernation, but they know about the Forgotten's golden cities. Maybe they even know about Tarir, and maybe they sort of just go there for a little while. So when Saul, the drunk, is wandering around in the jungle, he comes to Tarir with the nice Exalted asleep, and the Mursaat come to them and just basically pose as them. You see? And so then that's how they get a grip over everyone. It's a pretty cool theory. I don't see anything in lore that actually prevents it from happening. The only knee-jerk reaction against it, I think, is just, you know, maybe you don't like the idea that the Mursaat are somehow manufactured. But don't forget that there was some race that provided the souls for those Mursaat. So it could still kind of work. Anyway, it's a great idea. It's something I wanted to talk to you guys about. And yeah, to go back to my original statement, the Exalted that we know are not Mursaat, but the Mursaat are Exalted. And maybe that makes sense to you guys now. Anyway, this random lore, I did have more stuff prepared that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about our sister as a human, but I guess we'll do that at some point in the future. There's a couple more theories as well I'd like to talk to you guys about, but I've got a podcast to run very soon, so thank you very much for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think about the theory. I guess this is mostly just a Mursaat Exalted video, and we'll see what everybody thinks. Let's get the speculation rolling, and I'll see you for another episode of this pretty soon when we can get some more topics in. Have a great evening, guys. I'll see you tomorrow.